Okay, good evening, everybody, and welcome. Welcome to the 27th Annual Silha Lecture, which is sponsored by the Silha Center for the Study of Media Ethics and Law and the School of Journalism and Mass Communications. I'm Jane Kirtley. I'm the Silha professor and the director of the Silha Center, and it is my honor to welcome all of you here tonight. We are delighted to see so many of you here. Before I introduce tonight's topic and speakers, I want to briefly acknowledge Mrs. Helen Silha, who together with her husband, the late Otto Silha, provided the funds to endow this annual lecture. Please join me in thanking Helen and her family for their wonderful support. Thank you. So, when it's time to choose a place for dinner out, can you trust the restaurant reviews that you read? Professional reviewers who write for the legacy media have long been considered the gold standard. They are experienced, they are objective, they have expertise about food. But do these critics inhabit an elite world of foodies who don't relate to the ordinary diner and would never dream of giving a bad review to a chef who is also a friend? Even if they strive to keep their identities secret, as one of tonight's panelists does, don't they still receive better service than the ordinary customer? And for that matter, will a critic ever write a negative review about an advertiser? Or does any of this even matter anymore? Traditional critics don't hold a monopoly on restaurant reviewing. As you know, amateurs post on blogs, on social networks, on websites like Yelp, TripAdvisor, Your Urban Spoon. But are these reviewers the ordinary people that they pretend to be? Or do they have an agenda to promote or an axe to grind? Is somebody actually paying them to praise or to pan a restaurant? Do they know about the fundamental ethical concepts?
Check, check.
I have most of their books, and I love them. They are my Bible when I travel around the country. Their collaboration has produced more than 40 of them, and they have won awards for their columns in Gourmet and Saveur magazines, as well as the Sunday Supplement Parade. And I have to confess that I actually am one of the people that comments on the Road Food site under the name of Rumaki, and Michael just discovered this just a couple of days ago. Finally, our third mystery guest at our table is, drum roll, Rick Nelson.
Hi, everyone.
Who, as many of you obviously know, is the restaurant critic for the Minneapolis Star-Tribune, has held that position for more than 15 years. He's also a James Beard Foundation Award winner whose work has appeared in multiple editions of the Best Food Writing series. He also chats online with readers about dining out on most Thursdays. Rick, as you see, is one of those critics who strives to maintain anonymity, and we'll see how successful he is in that tonight. I know we're all starving to hear what our panel has to say, so it is my pleasure to get off the stage and introduce the 27th Annual Silha Lecture, A Question of Taste, the Ethics and Craft of Restaurant Reviewing.
Well, I want to thank you all for coming, and Jane, thank you. This is an honor, and I think this is going to be an interesting evening. This is what I thought we would do. I have an agenda of questions, some of them Jane's highlighted, that I'd like to talk to both of our panelists about. But I think it would also be interesting to open up to questions earlier rather than later, and we'll weave wherever your questions take us into what we discuss. So as we're talking, think about what occurs to you. What do you want to know more about? I had an interesting experience about 6 or 8 months ago. I was in New York, and there was a restaurant that had been very well reviewed. It was a seafood restaurant, and it was a major investment for someone. The chef was well known. It had opened about 2 weeks before I went. And I was seated with a friend at a row of tables. So there were deuces, seating for two, going down a long row. And this was the kind of place where supposedly your wait person could tell you everything from, the fish's first name to how it grew up and where. And it prided itself on magnificent food. And the first thing that happened was, it was called a chowder house, and we sampled the 3 famous chowders, all of which were not very good. The next thing that happened was, the people sitting next to us were served their main course, which were grilled fish, and there were French fries. And I became aware of them because the woman said to her partner, "These were frozen." And he said, "My God, you're right." And they called over the waiter, and then his fish wasn't done properly. And they called over the waiter to tell him what they thought was going on, and the waiter made a huge mistake. The waiter debated with them. The waiter said, in essence, "You really probably don't know what you're talking about." And the woman said to him, in no uncertain terms, "We're New Yorkers. We eat out 4 or 5 times a night. We know what we're talking about." But as all of this was going on, the man was sitting there doing this. And all I could think of was, this is the new world of restaurant reviewing. And I wonder how long the place is going to be open. So living now in an era when this idea of the reviewer is taking on a whole new face. Where's the validity? Where are the ethics? And do the traditional legal and journalistic ethics apply? And we have 2 people here who represent 2 different dimensions of restaurant reviewing. Rick writes for a local paper. He's engaged with the local community. He attempts to maintain anonymity. And he is reviewing restaurants, and of course, his reviews affect that business. Also affects our choices. Michael is someone who has written many books, has created the concept of road food, essentially, back in the days when people would travel. You started in the 70s, wasn't it?
78.
78, because I remember when the first road food guide came out, and here it was about these local places you always look for and never find, and end up eating at a chain restaurant when you're on the road. And I thought, why didn't I think of that? And 90% of the food community was saying the same thing. But your picture's on the website, you're known, and you're reviewing places that you don't necessarily live in the same community with. And you're not necessarily going to be associating with those cooks and those chefs on a weekly basis. Then there is the definition of the ethics of restaurant reviewing. And Rick, you said the American Society of Food Journalists, is that the correct name of the group?
The Association of Food Journalists.
The Association of Food Journalists
Yeah.
has a code of ethics.
They do. And I think it was kind of born out of what Craig Claiborne started when he started writing about restaurants.
In the New York Times back
Right.
in the 60s.
Right.
Yeah.
It follows a lot of those tenets about, you can't have a financial investment in the industry that you're covering. You can't have personal relationships with the people that you're writing about. You can't accept anything for free from the people that you're writing about. Those kinds of rules.
Yeah, go back 3 times.
Go back 3 times.
A minimum of 3 times.
Right.
And order broadly from the menu. And ideally, never let them know who you are.
And try to be as anonymous as possible.
Yeah.
There's really nothing worse than being recognized in a restaurant, I have to say, when you're a restaurant critic. So from my point of view anyway.
What does that feel like?
Well, first of all, it makes my job really hard because I'm trying to have the exact same experience that any other reader of the newspaper would have when they walked in the door. And so that's, I think, the real reason why critics try to remain as anonymous as possible. And I'm not kidding myself. I know that people recognize me around town, but you'd be surprised how often they don't. And I'm not the kind of person who does the disguise thing. I find that silly as a man.
Rick, you're sitting there with the umbrella.
But, yeah.
I just want to point that out.
No, is that the way he walks into restaurants?
Right, exactly. It's the guy with the umbrella. No, but like I can't imagine sitting in a restaurant in a bad wig and everyone would go, "Oh, look, there's Rick Nelson in the back." You know, I try to rely on things. You know, I do all the standard tricks. I make reservations in other people's names. Hopefully, I remember them when I get to the restaurant when I put them on it. I have a credit card with someone else's name on it. The bill goes to some poor person at the newspaper who has to deal with my expense report. I feel terrible about that. And I also kind of rely on the fact that I look. If you are of Scandinavian descent and you're a man my age and you live in Minneapolis, chances are you look like me. And there's a lot of us. And so I feel like I really blend into the woodwork. And unfortunately, well, not unfortunately, my partner, who dines out with me with some frequency, is very distinctive looking. He's Armenian, he's very handsome, and I think people remember him and sometimes think that I'm him, which I find enormously flattering.
Let me ask you this, though. Do you sort of have an unlimited budget with the paper?
Oh, if only you. Can you call the publisher and ask him to give me an unlimited budget, please? No, but the paper puts an enormous amount of money into the investment of reviewing restaurants, which I think is tremendous. Not just because I have my own self-interest in it, but because I think the powers that be at the newspaper see that this is a way to really capture an enormous readership, and so they view it as a smart investment. I mean, I don't know that I'm supposed to say how much we spend a year, but I will tell you that once, about a year ago, I bumped into the editor of the paper who, there's like 17 rows of, stacks of people between us, so she and I don't have a lot of interaction. But she said, and she laughed and she said, "I should tell you, I was going over expense reports the other day and this enormous one landed on my desk and my God, it was yours." That made me nervous.
And you do the 3 visits?
Yes.
Generally.
Yes. If it's a starred review, it's at least 3 visits. Depending, I sometimes will go more. I like to go by myself and sit at the bar, so sometimes that'll be my 4th visit, just to see how they treat people who come by themselves.
And will you order the same thing several times over?
Yeah, to see if there's a consistency among the different visits. And I'll go like on a Tuesday night, and then I'll go like on a Thursday for lunch, and then I'll go on a Saturday night when the place is supposed to be hopping. So,
right.
Yeah.
Right. Now, Michael, you're sort of on the other end of the spectrum in one regard, because we know what you look like generally. If we go to the site, go to our site, or look at so many of the publications that you write for. And how does that play in the reviews that you and Jane do?
Well, if I walk into Bub Sweatman's Barbecue in Holly Hill, South Carolina, with a sign around my neck saying, "Here comes the writer for Gourmet Magazine," nobody would care. They just want to make sure I pay my bill before I leave. Right. So it's a completely different set of circumstances. And the way Jane and I look at restaurants, we don't abide by a lot of those rules of restaurant review, and we oftentimes cannot visit a restaurant 3 times. We might go there once and hopefully another time on the way back. And also, it's a whole other level of restaurant. I mean, basically what we do at Road Food is to discover restaurants that are worth going to. Nobody cares about some obscure barbecue parlor in Sallisaw, Oklahoma, if the beans aren't quite up to snuff. I mean, that's not something that it's important for me to write about. On the other hand, for several years, Jane and I had a gig as the restaurant reviewers for the Hartford Courant, and it was a similar thing. We were consumer reporters. It was a small community. We went to restaurants several times. We did abide by all of those rules, and I can say the few times that I could tell we were recognized, in fact, the meal that we got was probably a lot worse than a normal customer would get.
Really?
Because they fussed and they fretted and it wasn't quite right and it took forever and they were stumbling over themselves. It wasn't like we did not get a beautiful, effortless meal. In fact, being recognized, in the few cases where I could tell we were recognized, made it, as Rick said, a very awkward experience, but also really the meal was not nearly as good as if we had just been anonymous.
So what is your process?
The process is we hit the road, and it used to be, before there was an internet, and we used to hit the road and get lost and wander around. And this is the mid-'70s when, as you said, if you were a foodie, it probably automatically meant you were interested in French food or possibly Asian food. So the idea, we had very few resources of how to find tips to find these places. So we just did it accidentally. We just used what we call our road food radar. If a place looked interesting, we went in there. And in the early days, I think for every 10 restaurants we visited, maybe one would pan out as a worthy road food restaurant. Now it's very different, primarily because of the internet. We get so many suggestions from regular contributors to road food that a lot of them, I know that if I get a suggestion from a guy named Buffet Buster, that's his screen name at roadfood.com.
Or Rumaki.
Or Rumaki. If I get a suggestion from them, I'm going to pay attention to it because they've led me right in the past.
So now, essentially, you have informants.
So now I have informants all over the country, which makes my job has gotten easier and easier in a way. Plus, I think the kinds of foods that Jane and I started writing about in the mid-'70s are now recognized by a lot of people, even the people that cook them, as kind of significant. I mean, back in the '70s, if you ran a fabulous fried chicken restaurant in Atlanta, Georgia, that's what you had, a fried chicken restaurant. It wasn't a big deal. Now I think enough Food Network people have been to them, and they've been written up enough times, and people walk in taking pictures of their food. They have recognized that what they're doing there is sort of cultural importance, which wasn't true 30 years ago.
That's a whole different. I mean, the whole sense of food has changed so dramatically in this country, and I guess that's a major part of it.
It is. I think what Jane and I used to write about what we called America's culinary inferiority complex. That, the idea of, when the Kennedys got into the White House in 1960, the French chef. And the idea, could you imagine today an American president hiring a French chef? It would never happen. It couldn't be done. Because I think, for better and for worse, I think we're pretty much over that culinary inferiority complex. And I think people recognize that, American food, while it doesn't have, the codification of other cuisines, it's incredibly diverse, and it does really reflect, the kind of anything goes culture of this country. And sometimes that's for better, and sometimes it's for worse.
When you two actually go into a place, how do you approach it?
Well, it's a whole set of circumstances. For one thing, if we get a tip that you've got to try the banana cream pie at the, at a certain bakery,
right,
we're going to go in there with certain things on our hit list. The other thing that we do, and it's so obvious, and I can't believe a lot of people think, wow, what a great idea. We walk in, and if it's a small town cafe especially, we'll kind of walk in and maybe look for a seat more than we have to and see what's on everybody's plate. If 90% of the people are eating catfish, you think, well, this is probably
a good idea to order catfish.
Exactly. Yeah. And further and beyond that, you look, are the people happy eating the catfish? You can tell. You can tell. Are they waving to try and get some help from a waiter? There are all of those cues that I think a lot of people don't necessarily use. What they use is, well, I read that this is good, so I'm going to go there and eat. And even if they walk in and it smells bad and somebody is complaining because the fish is frozen or whatever, they'll sort of proceed with it and sort of ignore all of those intuitive things that I think anyone has in terms of a restaurant meal being good or not.
Now, do you kind of make it obvious because you order 4 main dishes to taste everything?
Well, we do, because obviously if we're only going to be there once or even twice, and it's usually just the two of us, we order, 2 or 3 or 4 main courses and 5 slices of pie. And one of the things, Jane carries a really big purse and a lot of plastic bags, and we do, because a lot of these restaurants are like lovely mom and pop places where you really are going to trouble somebody if you don't finish the pot roast, it's really going to bother. Is there something wrong? Can I bring you something else? And that's, even when we do explain, no, we're writing about different restaurants, and we have 6 more restaurants to eat at today, so we can't finish. people don't register that.
Right.
So we, in fact, shovel a lot of food into plastic bags into Jane's purse.
I can just see your hotel room at night.
Yeah. The only time it hasn't worked is like when we're eating a lobster and Jane shovels the whole shell into the bag. The waiter says, "What's it?"
So now you've eaten, right? Do you, and the people are getting an idea that maybe you're not the average customer. Do you interview?
Occasionally, yes. If there's something that requires interviewing, yes. Because as I said, I mean, those rules of restaurant reviewing that I think do apply to a community, if there's something really unusual about the sausage, I might talk to either the waiter or the cook, say, where do you get that, or what is it? And now, again, that's a part of my job that's gotten a whole lot easier over the years, because now it's not that unusual for people to go into a town cafe and be curious about their food. It's not even unusual for people to take pictures of the food they eat. There are whole websites devoted to pictures of food that people eat. When we started, and people saw me taking pictures of the food, I originally was kicked out of a lot of restaurants because they thought I was from like the health department, or I was somebody who was going to open a competing restaurant, and I was taking pictures of the way their dishes look. Now nobody pays attention to somebody taking a picture of their food because so many people do it. The other thing that I have to say is that in addition to sort of eating as many different foods as we can, and sort of trying to eat what are the highlights of the menu based on maybe if a restaurant says it's the home of such and such a sandwich, we're going to eat that sandwich. The other thing that's really important to us, and I think this to some degree differs from a community restaurant reviewer, is that for us, the experience of going into the restaurant is in many ways more important than the way the food tastes. I mean, obviously the food has to be good for us to recommend it. But for us, the hospitality, the way other people treat us. I mean, when we started, this wasn't too long after Easy Rider, and people with long hair like I had in those days would go down to the South and get killed, for just being long-haired. So we were kind of very nervous. And in fact, what we realized, in many places, when people saw that we were truly interested in what they were eating, they opened. How great. They really wanted to tell us all about it. But for us, the experience, I learned this long ago from a restaurant writer named Seymour Britchke. I don't know if you remember him. He wrote a newsletter called Restaurants of New York.
Yes,
and they're brilliant, brilliant reviews. And if you look at them, what's amazing is maybe 25% of the review is devoted to describing the food, and the rest is the experience of eating at that restaurant, how you're treated, where you're seated, what it looks like, what the other people are doing, what the noise level is like, what it's like even to drive into the parking lot, or what it's like even to find it on some back road. For us, that's very much a part of the road food experience in a way that it might not be if it's a restaurant at the corner of Madison and 34th Street.
Well, you remind me, because I'm wondering how you feel about this, Rick. I remember two very dear friends who loved to eat, really enjoyed food, whatever, and they were celebrating their anniversary, and they went to a restaurant. This happened in Colorado, and they went to a restaurant, and I said, how was dinner? And they said the food was mediocre. It was the best meal we ever had.
Yeah.
And the reason was this was one of those places. First of all, it was a night for them that was special. Secondly, it was everybody in the place was really, the service was wonderful. The management really knew how to make people comfortable.
Right.
And a lot of people would go to this place and they would admit the food isn't the be-all and the end-all, but that experience, you come away saying, wow.
Right.
Does that happen to you where, I guess it's very tricky to review a restaurant, have that kind of experience, feel like other people in the room are having it as well, but the food is not necessarily great.
Right. I mean, people go to restaurants for all kinds of reasons. Sometimes the food is the very last reason that people go to a restaurant. They go because it's a really cool room and they love sitting in the room, or there's an amazing view of the water. Although the food's awful, but you go because you want to see the lake, Yeah. Or because the cocktails are really terrific, or there's the maitre d' makes everyone feel like they're their long-lost best friend, and they just feel like they've been wrapped in a shawl every time they walk into the room. I mean, people go to restaurants for all kinds of reasons, so I try to have as many kinds of experiences that I can possibly have in the restaurant, so I can at least share at least a little bit of something when I write my 550-word review.
What turns you off? What is it that really bothers you?
Lack of hospitality, or hostility is even worse. I mean, that to me is the main thing. If you walk into a restaurant and most of the restaurants I go to don't have maitre d's, but if the waitress says, "Hi, hon, how you doing?" I love it right away. I'm happy. If the cook says, "Hey, did you like those eggs?" Wonderful. But on the other hand, if they give you an argument about, if you say, "This doesn't quite taste right, is there something wrong with it?" and they start debating, that really turns me off. I mean, it is the hospitality business. And when that isn't present, no matter how good the food is, I probably wouldn't recommend a visit there.
What about you, Rick?
That's a big part of it for me too. And sometimes it's a little thing like, how clean is the restaurant? I always go into the men's room because I always want to see if the bathroom's dirty, how bad can the kitchen be? You know what I mean? Those kinds of things.
So scary.
But for me, it's also really about hospitality. If you're treated warmly, I think of restaurants as the extensions of people's homes. The people who own the restaurant is their home, and you're coming into their home. I want to be, hopefully they're treating everyone who comes into their commercial home like a long-lost friend. We're so glad you're here. What can we do for you,
Is there, how often, what percentage more or less of experiences for you is, it's not hospitable, and maybe it doesn't look clean, but the food experience transcends it?
For me, that happens a lot in certain types of restaurants. There's a restaurant in Chicago. It's called the Wiener Circle, and they specialize in great Chicago hot dogs. You know what I'm talking about. The abuse they deliver to customers there is part of the experience. If they treated me nicely, I think there's something wrong with this place. So in that sense, there are some restaurants where, some of the old New York steakhouses, not so much anymore, but those gruff waiters.
And the delis.
And the delis, exactly.
Where abuse is an art.
Exactly, and that's part of the experience. So in that sense, it's kind of welcome. But when you're really treated meanly and you feel like they're actually being mean, they're not doing a shtick, that's a whole other set of circumstances.
Yeah, does seem to be something that has died, which is that idea of an upscale restaurant making you feel as though you're so fortunate to have arrived.
Yes.
And that maybe if you're really lucky, we'll give you a toothpick, salt, and a glass of water.
And then we'll take your money. Just,
Yeah. And if you complain, I'm sorry, you're out of here. We'll never allow you in the room again. What is the thing that you think about most as you're writing that review?
Oh boy, that's tough. Our reviews, you have a lot of things you have to get into a review. You have to get, first of all, you have to get all the facts right. So I usually call and I interview some people at the restaurant to make sure that I'm getting things right. Then I'm trying to, you have to tell a story and you have to be entertaining so people will read you. I want everyone to read me. But I also want to impart some kind of expertise in what I'm doing. It's really hard because it kind of depends on the restaurant and the style of the restaurant, or if I'm going to praise it with, gush over it, or if I'm going to be kind of lukewarm about it. I guess it kind of depends. I don't think there's a strict format, is I guess what I'm saying.
Has there ever been an experience where the restaurant's a major advertiser and you're not totally pleased? Has there ever been pressure?
No, I actually don't know who advertises in the newspaper until I see the newspaper on my doorstep. We have no idea who advertises in the paper. There's a very strict wall between the newsroom and the sales department. And no one's ever really pressured me, or has ever even said anything to me ever once.
With newspapers, there's always been two, or at least in the past, there was the complaint that the person who got to review restaurants often had absolutely no background in food. They might have been, reporting on state politics, and then the next thing happens is the food reviewer leaves, and, well, it means free meals if nothing else. Let's put so-and-so on the beat.
I can't imagine that happening now. I can't imagine that happening even in the last 15 or 20 years, I think, because of the explosion of great food writers. Although, there's just such a large pool from which to select people to write about food. It just did not exist 20 years ago.
Although, may I just say that neither Jane nor I had any experience whatsoever in food or writing about food when we started. We were flying completely blind, and very often when we wrote the first edition of Road Food, we looked at each other and said, "What the hell are we doing? We know nothing."
But there is a
But you know what?
philosophy. Go ahead, I'm sorry.
But what we did know, and what my field of interest was in school, was American culture. And I mean, not to sound this sounds so obnoxious, but my favorite thing anyone has ever called us is cultural anthropologists. Because in fact, the way I see food is as part of the culture. I mean, food in a vacuum, delicious though it may be, is of little interest to me. What's important to me is everything around, what it means to people.
So when you're writing that review, what's primary in your mind? Are you thinking of, I'm assuming one thing for both of you, and I could be wrong, that you're thinking about what the experience is going to be for the person who walks in and they're not professionals and they're not.
Oh, exactly.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And for me, I mean, because I write about restaurants all over the country, generally I always try to make sort of the first point, why would you go to this restaurant? Because in a lot of cases, people go way out of their, travel 300 miles to go to a restaurant that I might recommend. The first point I always want to make, and sort of the overwhelming one, is why do you want to go here? Because it's the ultimate, South Carolina oyster roast. And that's the point. And then step back and describe the other things about it, what it's like and what the food is like. But the first point I always want to make is, why would you even get out of the car or go out of your way to get there?
How much should a restaurant reviewer know about food and about the business? I know we have a couple of restaurateurs, at least here in the audience, and this is a complex, demanding business with very narrow margins. Generally, running a restaurant, cooking in a restaurant, working in a restaurant is very stressful. It's been said that a lot of reviewers live in an ivory tower and have no idea what it takes to get the food to the table. So how much should a reviewer know?
See, in some ways, I'm having no education in food. I am fortunate because I never hold anything that I write about up to a particular standard. It is what it is, and I can compare it to other versions of that dish.
But that's a standard.
Well, yes. I mean, it's a standard that develops over time. And I think,
Yeah.
and I think, that's real. I think I told you, like when Jane and I were doing restaurant reviews for the Hartford Courant, we gave a very bad review to a place that I felt really deserved it, and the person who owned the restaurant actually introduced in a bill in the state legislature that anyone to review restaurants had to either have been to had been to journalism school, a culinary academy, or had run a restaurant. And if you hadn't done one of those things, you could not write about restaurants in a newspaper. And I said that was fine with me as long as the same requirements were held for all the customers. The bill never got anywhere, needless to say.
Yeah, I can understand. But it's a good point. The famous Craig Claiborne from the New York Times, who supposedly set this standard, laid this out, took himself off to restaurant school when he got that job. So, Rick, what do you think? How much do you have to know?
Well, I think it depends on who you're writing for and the publication that you're writing for. I mean, when I started writing about restaurants, I was at the Twin Cities Reader, a free alternative weekly, and I started writing because the editor couldn't stand the restaurant critic and fired her, and he hired someone who he thought had a tremendous background in food, and as it turns out, she was a terrible writer. And so they would wrestle with her copy for 20 hours on the copy desk until they made it into something. So he said, I'm going to try it the other way around. And he came to me and he said, I really like your writing style, and I know that you love to cook, and I know that you're, from everything you say, all you do is dine out, and when you travel, all you do is dine out, and that's all you talk about. Why don't you try this? And I said, well, David, I don't feel all that comfortable. I don't feel like I'm an authority on that. And he said, fake it. And I'm not being glib when I said it, and I thought, I can't fake it, It's like, so when I first started, I didn't posit myself as this great authority who came down from Zeus and knows everything about everything. I really tried to educate myself, and it's funny. I think in restaurant criticism of all the jobs in the newsroom, it's a tremendous on-the-job training kind of place. The more you do it, I think the more you know. The more you know, the more you do. Do you know what I'm saying?
No, I understand what you're saying. There's one thing here, because I was thinking about other forms of critiquing. you critique art, you critique film, but restaurant reviewing is rather like reviewing theater and dance and music.
Right.
That there are so many variables from moment to moment when you dine out. You know, what the cook is facing with the chicken tonight. Someone decided not to come in. The experience varies so much.
Well, I'm sure all of us have had that experience of loving some restaurant so much that you want to take a friend to it, and you take the friend and the restaurant isn't so good that night. And that, you're right. I mean, there are some, the chef is off, something's off. I mean, that happens. And I mean, it's one of those things for which I think if that happens to me, if I'm going to a place that comes highly recommended by somebody I trust and the meal isn't so good, I'll really think twice about it, try to get back there and see if in fact or I'll try and find out if indeed something's changed since I got the recommendation.
There's something else too that I think is do you each think it's important for a reviewer to lay out their own standards, how they do their job, so that the reader knows where you're coming from? Rick, what do you think?
Some newspapers put a little quip at the bottom of every restaurant review. The reviewer visited 3 times. They paid for all of their own meals. They make all those rules.
Right.
We've never done that, and in part because our real estate is really valuable in our print edition, and so that's just, that's another paragraph that we can't write about a restaurant. But I can see the value behind doing that. I guess I'm hoping that readers make assumptions that we are doing things a certain way, and the way we do things there's a reason why we do things, and that they find value in that.
Yeah, I think that in most cases, I don't know. It's, I think the assumption is that I don't know. Rephrase the question for me.
Should you or do you
all right,
lay out your standards and saying, this is where I'm coming from, reader?
See, I think that most people read a particular reviewer regularly, and I think eventually those standards become pretty clear. I mean, I don't think they have to be stated overtly necessarily, although, I've had the experience of those times when I do go into a restaurant, have a wonderful meal, and there's something about it I really want to find out more about, and I'll, find the cook and ask her a question, and I'll say, I'm going to be putting this, in a book that's coming out next year, and just say, well, what would I have to pay to be in the book? Because the assumption still is for a lot of these people that I'm selling advertising.
Yeah.
And I have to make it clear that I'm not. But I think, I don't think too many, I think most people assume that, when you review a restaurant, nowadays, you're not selling advertising. That you go in, if not anonymously, at least objectively.
Yeah, I'm remembering we were living in Belgium the first half of the 1980s, and Mimi Sheridan was then the reviewer for the New York Times. Very powerful position, obviously. And she, often reviewers traveled as well, would go to Europe or that kind of thing. And there was a restaurant group in Brussels who bought me lunch one day and were asking me who are the most powerful people in the New York area in terms of restaurant reviewing. And I was really naive. I didn't think to ask the reason why. And I mentioned Mimi Sheridan. And then I didn't know Mimi well. I got a note from her and saying, what did you do? How dare you? Well, what had happened was this restaurant group had written her saying I had recommended them to her, and they were offering her a first-class round trip to Brussels, stay in the finest hotel, eat in all their restaurants, and obviously she will give a good review. So I contacted them, and I said, what? Furious. And they said, but it's always worked before. Now, they weren't dealing with American reviewers, but that opened up this whole thing about, what I'm reading in the paper or whatever is a case of someone who is paid off. Yeah. Does this still go on?
I hear tale of it going on, but I can't imagine, well, I know for a fact it does not go on in any major metropolitan American daily newspaper.
If somebody discovered it, it would be a scandal.
It would be a scandal. They'd be fired immediately.
Right.
And a few people who have had some difficulty, let's say.
Yeah. And again, my position is so different. I mean, there are some restaurants that I've written about for like 20 or 25 years, and I know the owner of the place. And there are some of these mom and pop places, will absolutely, I am not allowed to pay for a meal. And no matter, it gets to the point where it's like ridiculous. I'm insulting them to not take their hospitality. And it's like a very weird position to be in. I say, no, I'm on an expense account, even if I'm not. And they absolutely not. Your money is no good here. And it puts me in a very funny position, because what if I go there the next time and, it's really not that good? Am I going to write a bad review of them? I mean, because there was, it really becomes a horribly difficult situation, And
Let's go back for a minute to that experience that I had in New York, where the man is sitting there texting away and reviewing the experience, and I'm thinking about how many people does he do this to? That's the new world of finding out about where to eat and hearing about opinions. But this is being done by people who are not necessarily trained or whatever. How do you two see the blogger? Now, there are many who are very talented and some who are just wanting to talk about what their experiences are.
Right.
How do you view, because this is competition in one regard.
And part of it is, one part of me thinks the more people are talking about food in restaurants, blogging about them, tweeting about them, throwing up things on Instagram, I think that's fantastic. I think the more people who have a burning interest in the subject that I cover only makes my subject more interesting. The flip side of that is I have a problem with sites like Yelp or the earlier version of the Zagat Guide, because we don't know who these people are. They could, if I owned a restaurant, I would have every single person I know write the most glowing, fantastic review of my restaurant. Or the flip side of that is, what are all the negative reviews? This was mentioned earlier. Are they all disgruntled former employees? Are they loathsome ex-spouses? Or are they actually real people who, or do they just have an axe to grind for something? We just don't know as a reader. And so I think you have to approach those as a consumer with a little caveat emptor, because you just don't know. Whereas hopefully they look to someone like me at the newspaper and say, well, hopefully this guy, he doesn't have any axes to grind. Hopefully I don't. Yeah. That I'm not taking any free things from anyone. I'm just trying to be a reporter and share information based on my own experiences.
And also the readers know you.
They
read you regularly,
right.
And so they know
Right.
the things you like, you don't like.
Right.
And so, when you have an opinion, they're already set, how they're going to react to it, which a blogger, most bloggers, unless they're very successful or not, it's just a voice. I think you do have to do a lot of, reading between the lines and taking things with lots of grains of salt. Sometimes, if I'm wondering about a restaurant I got a tip on and I'm not sure, and I do go to Yelp and they're like, 28 really negative reviews, well, I'll think, well, maybe I don't want to go there.
There's a large family at work, perhaps.
It could be a total.
There have been so many tales about,
Yeah.
I'm going to close these guys down, kind of thing, or I want to make sure my restaurant is really popular. How many bloggers are here tonight? Really? Only a few? Oh my! That's interesting. Huh? I think everybody's out eating. They're all out blogging. They're in the overflow seating. Okay, that's the secret. Questions? Yes, over here. And if we can't hear, I can repeat the question.
Yeah, it sounds good.
It sounds like you're there. Yeah.
Yes, no.
Sure, and I can repeat it.
No.
Okay, anyways, I was wondering, so you kind of emphasized that you're looking for like mom and pop experiences. This is a question specifically for Michael Stern. Do you ever think
Question for Michael. You're looking for mom and pop
do you ever
experiences.
think like revealing these places is going to kind of ruin that aspect of them and kind of, you have that hidden gem, maybe you want to keep it hidden?
I used to answer that
Let's
question.
just repeat the question.
Okay,
though.
the question is, will my discovering some out-of-the-way little mom-and-pop restaurant ruin it? Because suddenly it's going to be flooded with people going to it. I used to answer that question with great certainty saying no. Because, the number of, if it's someplace in southern Nevada, how many people is it really going to change? A restaurant reviewer in a community, in a city newspaper, a bad review can kill a place and a good review can overwhelm it and kill it with kindness, because suddenly they're overwhelmed with customers, they hire new help, they streamline the menu. I mean, that can now I have seen many restaurants that we wrote about. Well, there's one, maybe some of you know, do you remember the Norsky Nook up in Osseo, Wisconsin? All right. When we went there in 1977 for the first edition of Road Food, it really was a charming little small town cafe with the pies set out on newspaper on the counter, just a road food dream. They still make good pies and people love the place, but it's completely changed. I'm not saying I'm totally responsible for it, but after we wrote about them, then Helen Meyer, who ran the place, appeared on David Letterman, and things happened. It is an issue. I mean, and there are some places, actually I was sitting with Stephen Rushmore, who created the website with us, and we were eating at a pizzeria that we found in West Haven, Connecticut. And it has been there since the 30s. It's a family-run place. It's now in the third generation. And we were looking at it. It had never been written up on our website. This is a couple years ago. We thought, should we just keep this to ourselves? In fact, we didn't. We put it on the website, and it hasn't changed. But it is an issue. I mean, the effect that we have is nothing like the effect that if one of the TV food guys goes there. That really can totally change it, and I've seen that happen.
This reminds me of something. You always hear that you shouldn't review a restaurant until it's been in business for, what, about a month?
Like 30 days, yeah.
Like 30 days.
Yeah.
But if a restaurant opens and it's charging full price, I'm a customer. Do I stay away the first 30 days because they're not ready? Or is their job to open up and be ready? Blast them because they're charging. You know, charge me half price and tell me we're working out the kinks,
Right.
and I'll be happy. But
It's like preview
shouldn't
price.
you be, no, but isn't it fair that a reviewer goes to see what they're doing when they're bright and fresh and new, you know, within those first couple of weeks?
Well, for us, we wait because restaurants generally get one opportunity to be reviewed in the newspaper, and it's a big deal to be in the newspaper. The newspaper is an enormously powerful instrument in the Twin Cities. It drops on 300,000 doorsteps, which means that if you're like our household, 2 people read it. That's 600,000 people that will hopefully they'll read what I wrote. You know, let's just say that even half of those people, that's a lot of people, and so. I want to be as accurate as possible, and restaurants change so much in the first month. A lot of them do anyway. I want to be able to capture what I think is going to happen when somebody reads my review. I want that to be the experience when they go in and experience it, not something that because in the second week everything changed because we realized we couldn't do that, or you know what I'm saying?
I mean, I just wonder. Well, okay, so that means the review doesn't come out until that 30-day period or longer is going on.
Yeah.
Rick, I'm just curious, have you had it happen that you write a glowing review of a place, and because of that glowing review, it changes?
Yes and no. It's not been my experience because I often just don't go back to places, even because I know like they'll be ruined. Ruined like you can't get in for a long time. I'll wait myself personally 3 or 4 months, but I will have people who say, wow, what were you thinking? Because that place we waited for 2 hours and it was a mess, and the food took an hour to get to the table and blah blah blah. I'm like, well, that's because there's 150 people standing outside and they're overwhelmed because this jerk in the paper gave them a really great review. So yeah.
Question right here.
Okay, and we do have mics, so
Yeah.
please wait for the mic.
Hi, huge road food fan forever. I just love you guys. And by the way, where is Jane? And
Jane had some medical issues. She couldn't make it, but she's fine. So she's back in
She's with us in
Connecticut.
spirit.
Yeah.
Let's put it
okay,
that way.
I'll take that. You kind of hit on it, Lynn, but you asked, have you guys ever worked in the restaurant business, in a restaurant at all? And the corollary question would be, do you ever consider opening your own
Oh
restaurant?
my God, no.
Oh Lord.
I've seen enough. The question is, it was on mic. No, that to me is one of the hardest jobs in the world. We were talking earlier. I mean, it's one of those jobs where you have so little control over so many aspects of what happens. The person who does the tablecloths didn't do it right, or the maitre d' has a cold. I mean, the number of issues. I mean, no, I would never ever consider being in the restaurant business, and we never have been.
Do you two, let's put it, okay, I'm going to phrase this a little differently. When I read those pieces that often show up in magazines and publications and online about, the best broth, okay, the best canned broth, and you see everything that was tasted, and then you see the opinions of the group that did the tasting. So you've seen the frogs that were kissed, and you see the princes that one of them or two of them turned into. Now, I know in the restaurant business, when you're out reviewing, maybe not at this point because you have informants and whatever, but generally you do kiss quite a few frogs before you get a prince.
Right.
But I rarely ever hear about the frogs. And I wonder if that is really, well, I don't want to say unethical, but I want to know where not to go. I want to know where
Do you really want to know that there's a cafe in Truth or Consequences, New Mexico, that you shouldn't go to?
Yeah. Because if I'm ever in Truth or Consequences, with my luck, I'll end up at that cafe.
Well, all right, we'll do all right.
But I'm really wondering, is this something that we should see more of it didn't make the cut? And I don't mean it done viciously. I don't mean it done, with the aim of doing hurt. But I think a consumer has the right to know what is really not a good example of this kind of place.
It's true, and that's not the kind of stories that we generally do as in newspapers. That's a real magazine-y kind of story, like the 100 best burgers. That's not.
But we never hear about the 100 worst burgers.
That's true.
And I think we are owed as a dining public.
We go back and forth on a number of friends of mine, other restaurant critics around the country, do things like their top 100 restaurants, lists like that, and some of them even rank them, and I find that an impossible thing to do. Where would you put Foxy Falafel versus La Belle Vie? Do you know what I mean? It's like how,
Well, you could categorize, but see, I'm thinking again, the 100 worst. Not done viciously, but in the name of, please save me money.
Yeah.
Because
Well, Rick said I think that is something that magazines do especially well. I know when Jane and I have done, roundups of all the fried chicken in the Illinois Valley. We'll say this one's the great one. This one could be better. This one. So we will do that.
I know you often, both of you, each in your own way, say, well, the hamburger wasn't great, but you want to eat this. Are we running way over? No, you're doing great. Oh, okay. All right. Okay. Questions. Over here, yes. We need a microphone for this.
You don't. Not for him.
Do you mind if I identify you? No. Or why don't you identify yourself?
I'm Mitch Omer, I own Hell's Kitchen Restaurant.
Mitch Omer, who owns Hell's Kitchen Restaurant. Yeah, we need the mic.
Need the audio there? Better? Okay. Anyway, I've been cooking for 39 years, and outside of the few women to my right and left, I'm older than most of the people. I've been cooking longer than most of the people in here. And I want these young people to know that we're really, food service-wise, with all three of them in the presence of what I consider deities. Lynne, Rosetto, Kasper writes about the food of Romagna. She writes about the food of the people, and that's not being done enough these days. Jane and Michael Stern write about the food that Joe Blow out here, who had a wish to make the best goddamn pork tenderloin, is doing it in Des Moines, Iowa, and they write about it. These are the guys that I read. These are the guys that most food people read. They're not doing molecular cuisine. They wouldn't know molecular cuisine if it bit them on the ass. And Rick Nelson is the same way. Now,
Don't
I'm
hold
not
back,
going to
Mitch.
patronize Rick too much. He's written about us. We've done good. We've done bad. I don't give a shit. He does a fair review. Overall, if you read his stuff, he does a fair review. All right, we've got people that write from Minneapolis, St. Paul that I hate because they don't give a fair review. They give a biased opinion, and they slam Minneapolis, they slam the Midwest. And anyway, I'm here to say good job to you. But my biggest thing right now is for you is, do we review a restaurant when they first open? Now, most restaurants have sunk all their money. They've borrowed more than they should. They've taken out bank loans bigger than they should have. And they've got a new staff that's working with a new system, new computers, different reservation systems. And we do what we can to get ready to open those doors. And what we do is we do a dry run with friends and family, and we bring them in and we serve them, and we try and run those tickets, and we try and produce food the way it's going to be when we open our doors to the paying public.
How long do you do that usually?
We do that for a couple days.
Uh-huh.
Then we do a soft opening. And a soft opening, if you don't know, is we open the doors and we don't advertise it. Anybody that walks in off the street, we serve them like we would. We double up on service, and we try and make sure that we learn those systems before we advertise our opening. Without fail, I've designed 3 restaurants in this city. I've opened 5. Without fail, the word has gotten out that we're going to open, and that soft opening becomes a nightmare. In Duluth, when we opened, I had people around the block, and we were not ready for that influx. The kitchen wasn't designed to do that. Here, when we moved to our new location, we were 4 times bigger than the old restaurant, and we weren't ready for the influx of people that came in. So thankfully, people like Rick, other people, gave us a few weeks to work out the kinks because we needed it, because we sent people away. We sent them away pissed off, and we sent them away eating free, but we sent them away because we weren't able to provide the food and the service in the manner that they expected from Hell's Kitchen or the Pickled Parrot or whatever, Dixie's. I designed Dixie's, and we had the same problem there when we did that. And
But you were not necessarily charging full price at that
when
point?
we opened the doors, when we did the soft opening, we're charging full price.
Okay.
But we've got more people than our system can handle. We've got more people than the staff is used to handling. As things settle down over that month or over those 3 months, when finally the reviewers give us a little time to work out the kinks, is when it's a fair review, I think.
It's a problem, though, because I think of it as a consumer. I don't go when a restaurant opens. And if I don't go when a restaurant opens until you get the kinks out, what happens to you? Do you follow my...
I get it.
You want to support a new business, but essentially most of us are not benevolent when we go out to eat. It's just the opposite. We want the experience is all about us. And, for a consumer, it presents a bit of a dilemma because I understand the problem, what you're going through as a restaurateur, but the message seems to be wait. And if enough people wait, you guys won't get to the 30-day mark.
When you open Amelia Romagna, we will, over on Grand in St. Paul, we will wait a couple weeks, and we will go, and we will dine together.
There's one thing about all 3 of us, I think we know, and we've each probably had our share of years in the food business. The admiration I have for you and your colleagues is immense because you are in one of the most precarious, demanding, ever-changing, state of flux businesses anyone could choose to go into.
Well,
I think the only one that perhaps is more precarious is to tell your banker you're going to become an actor.
Thank you.
And I never would I ever chance it. So I say bravo to you.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Can I just say, Lynne, that's why, for me, why my job is so interesting to me, because the people who are on my beat are fascinating, because, and I just admire them so much, and I just think they're extraordinary people, and they, in a lot of ways, restaurants to me are also like newspapers in that they're very deadline oriented.
Right.
They kind of start over every day and make something new that day, and they're incredibly collaborative. It takes about 1,000 people to make the Star Tribune every day, and restaurants are the same way. And so I love newspapers and I love restaurants for that same reason.
Do you think reviewers should do more, and bloggers and whatever, about telling the public this kind of thing? I mean, I don't know that there's an awful lot of information out there of saying, this is really what it takes to do this.
Yeah. You know, I mean, I think everybody, I mean, I know I've done this story of what it took to open a new restaurant, or I've spent a day working in a kitchen and writing a story about a day in the life of a really busy, popular restaurant. You know, those kinds of stories, but they kind of come few and far between. It's like fitting in the other things in your schedule to make it work.
Yeah, and I think I mean, if people are interested in it, I think they'll find it. But I mean, like, if you see a wonderful movie, you don't necessarily want to know how much trouble went into making it.
But you know, when I guess because I know how precarious cooking is and restaurants are, and I'm not saying making a movie is, I mean, far from easy, but, well, think about the popularity. How many of you have heard of the book called Heat by Bill Buford? If you want to know about, Bill Buford was the writer, I think he still is with the New Yorker.
I think he is, yeah.
Yeah, but Bill Buford had always been a serious home cook, and he wanted to know if he could hold up in a professional situation. He was a great pal of and admirer of Mario Batali, and he went into, Mario said, sure, come and cook, you know, or come and be part of the team at Babbo, Mario's sort of flagship restaurant. And Bill writes about it, and it sounds like a nightmare. He's also a wonderful writer, and he talks about what it really takes to actually do what you do when you work in a restaurant.
And the adrenaline required to get through that day every day, you know?
Yes, absolutely, yeah. And it's
extraordinary.
I mean, yeah, and it's a wonderful book. I mean, it's one of those books because he goes on from there. That book changed his life. I mean, in terms of what he's doing now. But back to questions. We had someone right over, yes, over here? Yes. And I promise, I'll get to the other parts of the room. You're live.
I've traveled the country quite a bit driving, and I've been amazed at, you know, like going through the Dakotas or Montana or whatever. Good food has come to the entire country. But just within that context of good food coming to the entire country, the food in the national park system is really crap. I'm just wondering whether you've all experienced that and what observation you have about good food going to the most isolated places.
Well,
The only place it's worse is in our public school systems.
well, and I think the problem with the school systems and the national parks is that, you know, and I'm sure Rick will agree with me on this, that in 99 out of 100 cases, what is behind a good or great restaurant is a person.
As a person,
who
absolutely.
cares dearly and deeply about that restaurant. And, you know, if we're talking about a public park, who's that person, you know?
Yeah, and it's usually not, I mean, there are people with great imagination and drive, but there were a few people I know in Kentucky, and I'm not sure if it was on a county basis or a statewide basis, there was one chef who was really trying to source locally, really make good food, keep it within a budgetary sense so that everybody could afford it. And that kind of thing.
Well, it's encouraging to see here in Minneapolis that the parks system in Minneapolis has finally gotten a clue and has gotten out of the food business because they're bureaucrats and they've been hiring and turning over buildings in the parks to people who really care about food. So there's places like Sea Salt in Minnehaha Park, which is fantastic, or Bread and Pickle at Lake Harriet, or the new restaurant that's opening on Lake Nokomis that Doug Flicker of Piccolo is going to run. I mean, that's really great and really exciting. And now we're not eating really bad hot dogs and horrible ice cream anymore, you know?
Yeah. Over here, I promised.
One of the things that you discussed was the ambiance that goes on in a restaurant. And I think that one of the things that we don't think about when we think about our restaurant experience is the conversation. And that is a real big part of your restaurant experience. You usually go with friends or a loved one or someone who you'd like to be a loved one, and you end up with not being able to hear across a table. And if you go with a table of more than four, for sure you don't hear across it. I was in one of the really popular restaurants in town where I just absolutely love the food, and the owner came out and we were talking, and I said, you know, Russell, I can't hear the people across the table from me. and can you turn the music down a bit? And the answer is, no, we like the buzz. People like the buzz. So why doesn't that become an integral part of the restaurant critique, that people can't hear themselves across the table?
Well, few of the restaurants that I go to, I agree. I mean, most of the places that I go to are the kind of places that have the jukebox in the booth, and that's usually quiet enough so you can't have a conversation. But no, I know what you mean. And in fact, just recently we made a date to have, Jane and I went into New York to have lunch with somebody. It was a business lunch, and we all walked into the restaurant at the same time, and we looked at each other and we said, we got to go, we mouthed, we have to go elsewhere, because we literally could not hear each other 2 feet away from each other.
I think it's kind of sad that restaurateurs have equated success with deafening levels of sound in their dining room. And I think people think, oh, this room is incredibly loud. We're really popular. This is what success is. And it's, for me, I don't know. There's a new restaurant in Calhoun Square where I have never felt older. I just is this just a factor of my age that I can't hear anybody because it's so old here? It's like, I'm only 52. I mean, granted, that's really old.
But those people are going to be deaf by the time that...
Yeah, exactly. And so I try, when I encounter that, I try to include that in the review in some way. And, but I think that's a really valid point. And actually, I should be doing something like measuring decibels and putting that in the review. My friend Tom Sietsema does that at the Washington Post. And he gets a lot of feedback on that in a really good way.
I have to throw something out that I tend to agree also about the noise level, and I don't think this has anything to do with age. And if I'm supposed to be having a good time when I can't hear anybody I'm sitting next to, I must be living, I'm on something. I can't imagine. But the table, so many tables. First of all, a rectangular table limits who you can talk to.
Right.
So when I'm in a group of 8 people and I'm at a rectangular table, I end up talking to the 2 people on either side and the people here. And if only restaurateurs would forget about the round table and think about the oval table, they could get more people into the room and everybody could see each other. And because they could see each other, they'd stay longer and order more food. That's number one. And the other thing is, tables that are so wide, and in a noisy place it makes it impossible, but tables that are so wide, you can't really talk. And if you're having a romantic dinner or you want to say something really intimate, you're shouting, "You're the best lover I've ever had," because the person is sitting over there, and you really want to, you wish you had a ping pong ball because it's that far apart. Right. And it's just, anybody here who runs a restaurant, please think about these things. It's not about ethics.
One of the great types of restaurants you find in the South is what they call round table dining.
Yes.
Where it's a big round table that seats maybe 10. And there's a lazy Susan in the middle with all the different dishes, and it's all family style. You just spin the lazy Susan and take what you want. And what's wonderful about those is that the food is bounteous, and you're always sitting with, unless you come as a party of 8 or 10, you're always sitting with strangers. And the bounteous food and the spinning of the thing just starts conversations go. It's like a wonderful experience.
But in Minnesota, that would never fly.
And why not, Rick?
I mean, a restaurateur that I admire so enormously, Lucia Watson at Lucia's in Uptown Minneapolis. When she opened a bakery cafe, she put a long communal table in the cafe, and she put up signs that said, "Ooh, communal table. It's okay, Minnesotans, sit down."
And did they?
No, she took it out. It lasted a year. It was a noble experiment.
All right, and I have to say, my former hometown, New York City, place where supposedly nobody is nice to anybody, those tables have become incredibly popular in a lot of places.
Right.
And people schmooze and talk but New Yorkers talk to each other everywhere.
Right.
Subway, bus, whatever.
Well, I was in Madison a week or two ago at a really great new restaurant with the worst name I've ever heard. A pig in a fur coat. That's the name of the restaurant. But it's essentially 2 long communal tables and maybe a little row of deuces along the wall. Completely packed, and maybe seats 45 people. I walked in out of the rain. I was by myself, and I was seated at a communal table surrounded by people on dates. And it was the most awkward. I spent the evening pretending like, oh my gosh, that light fixture is fantastic. So I would have loved to have had a deuce where I could have sat by my, but
Yeah, and just been by yourself.
Yeah.
What's the most unethical thing you've seen, each one of you, in a restaurant review?
I've seen where the reviewer didn't go to the restaurant and they wrote about the review. This was a really long time ago, and I won't name the person, but it was someone here in the Twin Cities who did not actually visit the restaurant, but had friends go and then wrote about it because they'd had a deadline. I thought that was kind of wildly unethical. Yeah.
Whoa.
Well, I would say it's the review where you're out to kill somebody.
Right.
Yeah.
The spite review.
Yeah.
And usually, I mean, the thing about those is at least I feel I can almost always tell when that's the case, because those people tend to go way off the deep end when it's clear the point of the review is to damage the restaurant. But I don't know if that's unethical or just bad.
This reminds me of something, and I don't think this was done certainly for that reason. But going back to this restaurant reviewer, Craig Claiborne, writing in the 60s into the 70s, and I think into the 80s in New York City for the New York Times. So the most powerful restaurant reviewer in the
planet.
city. Yeah, but at least in
Yeah,
New York
right.
City. And there was a very fancy, very, very highly thought of French restaurant called Le Pavillon. And he had a real love of this restaurant. And he reviewed it initially when it opened and gave it an incredible review. Very expensive, very shishi hoo-ha. He went back and reviewed it years later. And one of the things that he was highly criticized for was he talked about the butter being the improper temperature. That when the butter came out with the bread, it was hard. And that in a restaurant, it should be spreadable. And people made fun of him for that. And he said, this was his point, that when you are at that level of excellence,
It's all got to be there.
it's all got to be there. Now, this raises a question to me about the ethics and the standards. When you review a restaurant, are you reviewing it based on other restaurants in that part of the country? Where in your town or in, this barbecue, Kansas doesn't do great barbecue, but for Kansas barbecue, this is some of the best barbecue you'll find. Or do you have an absolute standard? Proper barbecue is done this way. It has these overall characteristics, and it doesn't matter whether it's met here in any way, shape, or form, but that's my standard. So, Michael.
No, it's definitely. I mean, I think the standards have to be set by the genre of the restaurant. I mean, I totally agree about it's really annoying to spend $100 for a meal and not be able to spread butter on your bread. On the other hand, some of my favorite restaurants are places where they don't even have paper plates. You get everything on butcher paper and carry it to the table, and you get a bottle of pop from the machine and crack it open. And that, for that type of restaurant, that's perfect. You wouldn't want a nice plate. You wouldn't want nice silverware.
But are you evaluating that restaurant based on not what's down the street and compare, but what those kinds of places really could be and should be?
Not necessarily. No, it's really based on what those restaurants are, not what they could and should be. What they are. And there's some. I mean, I just wrote a review about a place, a barbecue I found in Dallas, and the point I made about it was it looks all wrong for a barbecue because it's really clean and neat, and they have like nice plates, and the people are really polite, and there's no grease smell when you walk in. And I said it's all wrong, but the barbecue is really good.
What about you, Rick?
Well, I think it's a little bit of both, which sounds like a cop-out, but
It does sound like a cop-out, but go ahead.
I'm writing about restaurants in the Twin Cities. I'm not comparing them to restaurants in New York City or Los Angeles or Chicago. I'm writing about the scene here, and I'm not necessarily putting everybody on a grade and saying, well, I have this absolute standard, and if you don't meet that, forget it. I think, as Michael was saying, you have to judge a restaurant by what you think they're trying to accomplish, not by what you think they should be accomplishing.
But if a restaurant, I was on air with Lynne Russo, who has Heartland, on Monday, and one of the things Lenny pointed out, and this goes back to the question of how much should a reviewer know? And he said, you know, when a reviewer said my bouillabaisse didn't have enough garlic in it, the reviewer missed the point. You shouldn't be tasting the garlic in a properly made bouillabaisse. So that goes back to bouillabaisse is made this way.
Right.
It's not the total of what my question was about, but knowing this is the way it's really supposed to be. You see what I'm saying? You know,
Right.
you do apply that kind of standard.
But is the chef trying to make a witty play on bouillabaisse, and maybe they're screwing it up, or maybe this is their mother's rendition of bouillabaisse that they're trying to pay homage to, or they're trying to do a classic one. That's why I call people and ask them. So like, what's the deal with that bouillabaisse? Why was there no saffron in it?
And should a reviewer be educating? You're saying normally bouillabaisse is done this way, but.
No, that's not my role. I'm a journalist. I'm not an educator. So I don't feel.
But a journalist can be an educator.
I want to educate my readers, but I'm not educating the people that I'm writing about. For example, when things happen in a restaurant, I let them happen. Like, if the service is terrible, or it would never occur to me to send something back to the kitchen, for example.
Really?
No, I'm there to experience the restaurant as it's happening right there. I'm not.
See, I would always be curious as how do they handle that?
I'll let somebody else at the table do it if they want to, but just me personally, my guests can do whatever they want, but just me personally, I would never let that.
Interesting.
Yeah.
And I think there are some close to absolute standards. For example, if you've eaten at some of the great delis in New York, and then you go to one in Des Moines, and it isn't, and it's not near, the pastrami sandwich is like, you are going to compare it to, New York sets a certain standard, and similarly with, barbecue in Texas or whatever. And I think I don't know if they're absolute standards, but I think, the very best restaurants in a particular genre do set the bar.
Right.
Yeah, I remember there was a restaurant quite a while ago here in town that named itself after a particular Italian region, and when I went in, it was obvious nobody had ever even read a book about the region. Now, granted, I'm a tad picky on this subject, but it was, I think a lot of us would know a little bit, and then there was the Italian. Well, I think when Olive Garden first opened, they had chicken teriyaki on the menu. But that's another.
There are certain expectations that they're setting out for themselves by their very name. I mean, come on.
Yeah, exactly. Yes, over here. Can we get a microphone over here?
Could you tell me if there are any specific reviews that you've written that have generated the most response from your readers, or is there a kind of restaurant that people are more interested in? Is there any seasonality to it?
Well, it's an interesting phenomenon, and I cannot explain it. There is a restaurant in New Jersey called Rutt's Hut. It's a hot dog joint, and a real joint it is, where they deep fry the hot dogs, and they have their special sauce. And actually, who turned me on to Rutt's Hut is Martha Stewart, who grew up nearby.
You're kidding?
No.
Martha.
Who grew up eating these.
Who knew?
But anyway, for some reason, we have a way of tracking on roadfood.com how many people click on each review each day. For some reason, for the last 6 or 7 years, that restaurant gets more hits, gets 2 to 3 times as many hits as any other, and nobody knows why.
That's amazing. What about for you, Rick?
I can think of 2 examples. One, this was a number of years ago. It was a restaurant that's no longer with us, but it was awful, and it was just, it was comically bad, and it was a surprise because the people who were behind it had a really nice little restaurant prior to that.
What was the restaurant?
Portofino. It was in Rosetto on the lake. It's one of those things with a view and everything. And so I wrote a really, really negative, like one of the most negative reviews I've ever had in the paper. And I, the night before, and this was kind of pre-internet, before people were jumping on the web, and we didn't post things right away. So it was really like the morning it was going to hit doorsteps. I was like, I barely slept that night. I was like, oh my God, what if I've got this all wrong? I came into the office, and there were more almost 100 emails, all with the word Portofino in the memo, and I thought, oh, here it comes. I'm just going to get slammed. And I think 99 of them were, yeah, right on. That place sucks, man. and then they'd recite the experience that they'd had there. It was like, oh, thank God, I got it right. And the other one in the inverse is every year on the first day of the state fair, I go to the fair and I eat every new food that's being sold at the fair. I try to.
He has the constitution of a warrior. I mean,
it's one of those kind of weird, crazy stories. And then I don't rank them, but I pick highest to lowest. Like these are the ones you must have, and these are the ones that you absolutely have to avoid. So that's an example where I do that.
Yeah.
And you can't believe the response that readers get from that. I mean, usually before the fair, for weeks and prior, are you going to do that again this year? Where will I find it? And blah blah. Can I come along with you?
Questions over here, and then we will come up there. I promise.
You're all professional reviewers. I wondered if you would care to comment on the Grand Forks Herald review of the Olive Garden, and what were you?
Could you maybe briefly explain for some folks who may not be aware?
Well, a woman at the Grand Forks Herald, she's in her 80s, whatever. She probably got the assignment to go out, probably from the advertising department, go out and do a review on the new Olive Garden. Yes, she did.
She has a regular restaurant column.
In Grand Forks.
Okay, so anyway, you know how that went viral and all the attention she got and everything, and I just wondered what sort of what you would have to say about that whole idea.
Well, this brings up an interesting point, though. We've been talking about restaurant reviewers in cities, sizable cities, but when you're talking about a smaller town, there's a very different environment. And, first of all, does the paper have enough money to, cover the expense of a restaurant reviewer, and who's responsible to who, and everybody knows everyone? What was your take on that?
As a reader, I found it enormously dear. I thought it was incredibly sweet. As a critic, I was mortified because she based, I'm guessing it was like a 500-word review on a single entree and I think a Diet Coke. I think she said, next time I'll come back and try the strawberry lemonade, but not today. I thought, what, you couldn't fork it, you didn't have time to do the lemonade? I mean, come on. But I was in Grand Forks this summer and I did a little drive-by of the restaurant. It's like, oh, there's the famous Olive Garden. And in Grand Forks, the Olive Garden is a big deal. And so at least the newspaper covered it. I thought that was great.
As a matter of principle,
yeah,
I mean, it's fair game.
Yeah.
I mean, whether that review did what a review ought to do.
From where I sat, on one hand, I found it very dear, too. On the other hand, I was really disturbed at how snide people were about it.
Oh, yeah.
Because just as an example, I used to drive, Frank and my husband and I used to drive to Denver a great deal, and I used to do it, we have very dear friends there. I used to often do it by myself, and when I did it by myself, I always spent the night in Grand Island, Nebraska. And when I first started doing this in the mid-'80s, Grand Island had a ton of local restaurants. Yeah. And I tried them all, and they were great. I mean, there was the supper club, and there was the cafe, and all of that. And by the time I stopped making that trip on my own, which is probably in the late 90s, the early 2000s, there was not one local restaurant left. It was all chains. So if you're in that environment, you review what's there. I think the sweetness of this was not someone who lived and breathed food, had a very sweet piece to it. I wish she had been someone, I don't mean a snob, but just someone who had tremendous enthusiasm.
Yeah.
She was hesitant, and I think you either go for it or you don't, but that's me. Oh yes, this gentleman, with the very handsome beard.
I was at a taste bud seminar a number of years ago where we sat around for 4 hours with these world chefs from Albert Euster. They wanted to do a 8-inch cake and win the world competition for it. So they did this 53-page book putting pie charts, analyzing people's taste buds, and where we're going to put the sweet and the sour and the bitter into the dessert. And so we had all these anonymous cups that we had with different solutions in it, and we had to put our taste buds into perspective with the rest of the world, because our taste buds change throughout our life. Some of us have super tasters, some of us don't, and we get older, our taste buds diminish, and tobacco and other things do different things to it. I was wondering how you all rate your taste buds. And when you put...
I can say one thing about, how many of you are familiar with the idea of the non-taster and the super taster? For those of you who aren't, Linda Bartoshuk was a researcher at Yale, at the Yale Medical School, back about 10, 15 years ago. And she wanted to see if there was any relationship between the number of taste buds on our tongues and how we actually experience taste. And there is a solution called PROP. It's a dilution of bitterness that's often used in taste tests. And she would have people swab their tongues with, I think, blue food coloring. And it turns out that your taste buds show up either bright pink or whatever. And then you could use, you know those, when you have a ring binder, you have those sort of reinforcers. They're like donuts.
Right.
Well, you could press one of those against your tongue and count the number of taste buds in the circle. Some people might have 5, some people might have 10. And then you would be tasting the PROP. And it turned out the people who had more taste buds were, in quotes, super tasters. And the definition of a super taster was someone who had an acute sense of taste, but sometimes so acute, extreme flavors were almost painful for them. And by the way, super tasters are generally slender. And then there were, it blows me out of the water, you know, it's over. And then there were the medium tasters, more or less, fewer taste buds, less sensitive to very acute flavors and very strong flavors. And then there were the quote-unquote non-tasters. Well, they taste, of course, but not that high sensitivity. And one of the things that I asked her when we interviewed her was, and by the way, this completely throws off the idea that there is one thing that tastes good. And if it's made right, you will taste it. And if you don't know what you're talking. You know, in fact, all of us experience taste differently. But she explained she loved food, she loved to cook, and she realized she was a medium to non-taster. Which may be a person who's always looking for taste. Whereas many super tasters do not get tremendous pleasure from their food.
I could see if you were a super taster, you'd want bland food. Otherwise,
Yeah, right. You'd be
Yeah.
overwhelmed. It'd be like.
But your question is, where do we put ourselves?
Because food critics throw their judgment out to the public that, oh, that's a great dish. Well,
Yeah.
the next person down the road is allergic to cilantro or whatever, and you know, different taste buds, smokes a lot, can't pick up any of the flavors. I've been to wine tastings like that where I can't find that hint of pear or this or that, you know, in the Chardonnay.
You don't taste the lead pencil and the leather in the Bordeaux? What's Can I just make a comment and then I will stop talking? Since when have we ever seen a wine review that talks about the fact that the wine tastes like a grape? But how do you see yourself as a taster?
That's such a good question, and you know, I hadn't really thought about quantifying that before. That's a really interesting question. There are certain things that I think I'm sensitive to. I think I'm very sensitive to salt, for example. Like I feel like I can really, I'm a fairly good gauge of what is undersalted or what I would sense would be undersalted or what's just grossly oversalted or even in between. But beyond that, I don't feel that I'm a super taster because I don't shy away from any kinds of flavors, but I don't think that I miss things. I don't think I'm not down at the bottom. I bet if there's a bell curve, I'm probably in the middle, you know.
Michael, what about you?
I don't think
You taste a lot of highly seasoned food.
I do taste a lot
Not
of
that
highly
we don't,
seasoned
all of us
food,
don't.
But you know, the thing, what it gets down to is it's really, I mean, taste is one of those things that really is hard to describe. Actually, one of the former restaurant reviewers for the New York Times. I remember going to his house once and looking next to his keyboard. There was a big sheet of paper with just lists of adjectives on it, because he didn't want to use the same one twice. And really, I mean, to me, as I said this earlier, I mean, to me, just reviewing a restaurant, yes, I have to describe the food, but better to describe it than rate it. I mean, if I can simply describe it and tell you what it's like, what it feels like, you know, if it's crunchy, not crunchy, whatever, the few adjectives that I do know. More important than that is the experience of eating in the restaurant, and that I can describe in more detail. I think I'm more observant, maybe. I'm at sort of a higher level of observational facility when I go to a place, but my actual ability to taste the difference between this and that is, I know a lot of people are way better at it than I am.
And don't you think a lot of it has to do with sight too? I think our other senses are so involved in what taste is. You know, I think that adage about, you know, you eat with your eyes, I think is really true in a lot of ways. And that can either accentuate, I think, what you're tasting, or it can minimize what you're tasting in some regard.
I have to say, for me, because I cook so much, and that's another question, should a reviewer be a cook? But that's another thing that's another meeting. But I cook so much, I often try to identify what I'm tasting, but personally, I don't think I'm a super taster at all, and I'm probably a medium or non-taster. But I approach almost every restaurant like a 5-year-old on Christmas morning. And when I'm disappointed, I am like the kid who got white cotton underwear, and that was it. And my husband teases me about it forever, because I just literally, when I go into a restaurant I really anticipate a great meal in, I'm almost clapping my hands with, oh boy, I can't wait. And when they disappoint me, they've stabbed me in my heart. So that's, the taste ties into all of that. I think we can do one last question. And since we have it way up here on the left.
I'm sorry, this is the last. I'm sorry, this is the last question, but I'm wondering for all of you if, when you do finally choose to review a restaurant, if you feel pressure to write more positively about the restaurant for your own reputation. An example in Rick's case, when you're going to review Cafeteria, you have to give it a good review, because otherwise Phil Roberts will never answer the phone again when you call him.
Maybe you might want to give some context there for those people who are not familiar with Phil Roberts.
Phil Roberts is the head of the Parasole restaurant group in the Minneapolis-St. Paul area.
Phil, on my beat, Phil is the biggest quote machine in the city of Minneapolis. He gives the best quote ever. I mean, like, you can call him, and he's reliably the wittiest, funniest, and right on the money quote, you know, for whatever subject. I did not feel at all compelled to give Cafeteria a negative or positive review based on my cordial relationship with Phil Roberts. My duty is to write about, is to inform my readers of what's going on. We were talking earlier about relationships with people. I'm friendly with people on my beat, but I'm not friends with anyone on my beat, and I don't feel that I owe anyone any kind of regard because they're on my beat.
Do you hang out with or spend a lot of time with chefs and restaurateurs socially?
No, not at all. I think of people that I socialize with are people that I would have in my home. And I can think of one example in the 15 years that I've been doing this where I had a chef in my home, and it was because he had just moved to town. I'd ran into he and his wife downtown, and they were really charming, and they said, we don't know anyone, and I was having a huge Christmas party the next night, and I said, why don't you come to my house, and meet 80 people? And so they did, and that was the only time I've ever had anyone in my home.
How do you feel about the reviewer who's pals with folks?
I think that's ethically challenging.
That's a very discreet way to put it.
I think it's wrong, and you shouldn't write about people that you know. I mean, you should pass that duty off to someone else. It's wrong.
Recuse yourself,
yes.
Essentially. Yeah. Michael?
Well, I feel a certain obligation to write a good review because, I mean, my job is to find good restaurants.
Right. Yeah.
I mean, nobody would want an edition of Road Food that listed 400 restaurants you shouldn't go to.
But I would No. I would like to know the 75 that maybe you tried and you didn't like.
Right.
I want to know about
We'll
frogs.
put an appendix in the next edition.
Thank you. I appreciate it. I'd love to do a segment with you on the air of the ones that never made it.
All right.
On that note, Thank you both very much. And thank you,
you.
Jane, thank you.
Mic is not working still, but I wanted to invite you all to join us in the lobby. Two of our panelists will be signing copies of their books. So if you're interested in getting signed copies of Lynne or Michael's books, they're available to you in the lobby. We also invite you to pick up a copy of the Silha Bulletin and to fill out one of our comment cards. Let us know if you want to be added to the mailing list, and be sure to visit our website for our upcoming events, including our 28th annual Silha Lecture in 2013. Thank you so much, and good night.